The British had taken Havana briefly in 1762. The island's rural economy was then based on small tobacco plantations and on cattle ranching. Havana, a military bastion, had craftsmen with advanced skills and an important foundry manufacturing cannon and Latin America's first shipyard for building merchant and warships on a large scale. 11 months sufficed for the British occupiers to introduce as many slaves as would otherwise have entered in 15 years, and from that time on, the Cuban economy was shaped by the foreign need for sugar. Slaves produced it for the world market, and its bounteous surplus value was enjoyed by the local oligarchy and by imperialist interests. Cuban sugar historian Manuel Moreno Branganales describes with eloquent data the headlong advance of sugar in the years following the British occupation. Spain's commercial monopoly had in fact been blown apart, and all brakes on the entry of slaves had been removed. The sugar mills absorbed everything, men and land. To the mills went shipyard and foundry workers and the countless small artisans who had contributed decisively to the development of industry. Small peasants growing tobacco in the vegas or fruit in the orchards, victims now of the cane fields' brutally destructive advance, also turned to sugar production. Extensive planting relentlessly reduced the soil's fertility. Sugar mill towers multiplied in the Cuban countryside, and each one needed more and more land. Fire devoured tobacco, vegas, forests, and pasturelands. As dried meat, the Cuban export a few years earlier was by 1792 arriving in large quantities from abroad and was an import from then on. The shipyard and foundry languished, tobacco production plummeted. The slaves of sugar put in a workday of up to 24 hours, or 20 hours, excuse me. On smoking lands, the sugarocracy consolidated its power. In the late 18th century, euphoria of sky-high international prices, speculations ran riot. Land prices went up 20 times in guineas. In Havana, 8 times the legal rate of interest was paid, and throughout Cuba, the fees for baptisms, burials, and masses rose in proportion to the soaring prices of flax and oxen. Early chroniclers told of traveling across all of Cuba in the shade of giant palms and through leafy forests abounding in mahogany, cedar, and ebony. Cuba's precious woods may still be admired in the tables and window frames of the Escorial and in the doors of the Royal Palace in Madrid. But in Cuba, the sugarcane invasion sent the best virgin forests up in smoke. In the same years it was destroying its own timberlands, Cuba became the chief purchaser of U.S. timber. The extensive plunder culture of sugarcane meant not only the death of the forest, but also in the long run the death of the island's fabulous fertility. The forest surrendered to the flames, erosion soon did its work on the defenseless soil, and thousands of streams dried up. Present day per hectare yield from sugar plantations in Cuba is more than 3 times lower than in Peru and 4.5 times lower than in Hawaii. Irrigation and fertilization of the land are a priority task for the Cuban Revolution. Large and small hydraulic dams are multiplying. Fields are being irrigated and fertilizers being scattered over lands weak from centuries of punishment. The sugarocracy piled up their fraudulent fortunes while reinforcing Cuba's dependence. Among those who savagely devastated Cuba's fertile soil were persons of refined European culture who could spot a genuine Bruegel and afford to buy it. They returned from frequent Paris trips with Etruscan vases and Greek amphora, Gobelin tapestries, and mean screens, landscapes and portraits by the most fashionable British artists. I was startled to find in the kitchen of a Havana mansion an enormous strongbox with a secret combination which a countess used to protect her table service. Up until 1959, it was not factories but sugar castles that were built on the island. Sugar installed and removed dictators, gave or denied jobs to workers, decided the rhythm of the dance of the millions. The 1919-1921 boom period and the terrible crises. The city of Trinidad is today a resplendent corpse. It collapsed, never to rise again, with the collapse of sugar prices in 1857. In the mid 19th century, it had 40 sugar mills producing 700,000 arrobas of sugar. Poor tobacco farming peasants had been displaced by force and violence, and meat for the district, which had also raised cattle and had once exported meat, was being bought abroad. There was a flowering of colonial-style palaces with furtively shadowed porticos, chandeliers dripping crystal, and high-ceiling salons, Persian carpets, minutes, frankly breaking the velvet silence, or molu mirrors reflecting the graces of buckle-shod, bewigged caballeros, great marble and stone skeletons, proud silent bell towers, and Spanish carriages invaded by grass remain today as testimony to all this. Trinidad became known as the city of the hads because its white survivors always talked of past days when they had power and glory. When the Sierra Maestra guerrillos took power, Cuba's destiny was still tied to sugar prices. A people that entrust its subsistence to one product alone commit suicide. The national hero Jose Marti had prophesied. When sugar stood at 22 cents a pound in 1920, Cuba beat the world record in per capita export, even surpassing England, and had Latin America's highest per capita income. But in December of that year, the price fell to 4 cents per, and a crisis of hurricane force descended in 1921. Many sugar mills went bankrupt to be bought up by U.S. interests, as did all the Cuban and Spanish banks, including the Banco Nacional itself. Only the branches of U.S. banks survived. The 1921 disaster had been brought on by the fall in sugar prices on the U.S. market, and from the United States came a prompt credit of $50 million. On the heels of the credit came General Enoch Crowder, who, under the pretext of controlling the use of the funds, became Cuba's de facto governor. Thanks to his good offices, the Machado dictatorship came to power in 1924. But the Great Depression of the 1930s lay ahead for this bloody regime, with Cuba paralyzed by a general strike. The U.S. crisis of 1929 could not but have a fierce impact on so dependent and vulnerable an economy as Cuba's. The price of sugar sank well below 1 cent by 1932, and in 3 years the value of exports fell by 75%. At that time, the unemployment index would have been hard to match in any other country. What happened to prices was repeated volume of exports. The United States lowered import duties on Cuban sugar in exchange for similar privileges for U.S. exports to Cuba, but such favors only consolidated Cuba's dependence. By 1948, Cuba had recovered its quota to the point of supplying 1/3 of the U.S. sugar market at prices lower than U.S. producers received, but higher and more stable than those in the international market. Sugar production was arbitrarily limited by Washington's needs. The 1925 level of some 5 million tons remained the average through the 1950s. Dictator Fulgencio Bastida took power in 1952 on the heels of the biggest harvest in Cuban history, over 7 million tons. With the mission of tightening the screws, and following year, production, median to demand in the north, fell to 4 million tons. When Bastida fell in 1959, Cuba was selling almost all its sugar to the United States. As Marti said, and Che Guevara quoted at the OAS Punta del Este conference in 1961, the nation that buys commands, the nation that sells serves. It is necessary to balance trade in order to ensure freedom. The country that wants to die sells only to one country, and the country that wants to survive sells more than one. The Cuban revolt against the structure of impotence, geographical proximity, and the event of beet sugar production in France and Germany during the Napoleonic Wars made the United States the chief customer for Antillean sugar. By 1850, the United States was absorbing 1/3 of all Cuban trade, selling it more and buying more from it than Spain, whose colony it was. The Stars and Stripes floated from more than half the ships arriving at the island. A Spanish traveler found U.S.-made sewing machines in remote Cuban villages in 1859. The main streets of Havana were paved with New England granite. At the dawn of the 20th century, one could read in Louisiana Planter, little by little, the whole island of Cuba is passing into the hands of U.S. citizens, which is the simplest and safest way to obtain annexation to the United States. There was already talk in the Senate of a new star in the flag. With Spain's defeat, General Leonard Wood governed the island. At the same time, the Philippines and Puerto Rico dropped into the United States' lap. They have been conferred upon us by the war, said President McKinley, including Cuba, in his remarks. And God, with God's help and in the name of progress of humanity and civilization, it is our duty to respond to this great trust. In 1902, Thomas Estrada Palma had to renounce the U.S. citizenship he had acquired while living there in exile. The U.S. occupation forces made him the first president of Cuba. In 1960, the former U.S. ambassador to Cuba, Earl Smith, told the Senate subcommittee, until Castro came to power, the United States had such an irresistible influence in Cuba that the U.S. ambassador was the country's second personage, sometimes even more important than the Cuban president. In 1954, a young revolutionary lawyer accurately prophesied in his testimony to court trying him for the attack on the Moncada barracks that history would absolve him. Cuba, he said in his resounding defense plea, continues to be a producer of raw materials. We export sugar to import candy, we export hides to import shoes, we export iron to import plows. Cuba bought not only automobiles, machinery, chemical products, paper, and clothing, but also rice and beans, garlic and onions, fats, meat, cotton, all from the United States. Ice cream came from Miami, bread from Atlanta, and even luxury suppers from Paris. The country of sugar imported nearly half the fruit and vegetables it consumed, although only a third of its population had regular jobs and half of the sugar estate lands were idle acres where nothing was produced. 13 U.S. sugar producers owned more than 47% of the total area planted to cane and garnered some 180 million from each harvest. The subsoil wealth, nickel, iron, copper, manganese, chrome, tungsten, formed part of the United States strategic reserves and were exploited in accordance with varying priorities of U.S. defense and industry. In 1958, Cuba had more registered prostitutes than mine workers, and 1.5 million Cubans were wholly or partly unemployed. The country's economy moved in step with sugar harvest. The purchasing power of Cuban exports between 1952 and 1956 was no greater than it had been 30 years earlier, although foreign currency was much more needed. In the 1930s, when the crisis deepened the economy's dependence, instead of helping to break it, newly installed factories were actually dismantled to sell to other countries. When the revolution triumphed on the first day of 1959, Cuba's industrial development was poor and sluggish. Over half the production was concentrated in Havana, and the few technologically modern factories were manned by remote control from the United States. The Cuban economist Regino Bocci, co-author of the Sierra Guerrero's economic theses, cites the example of Nestle's affiliate producing condensed milk in Bayamo. Quote, when there was a breakdown, the technician simply phoned Connecticut and told them what he thought had gone wrong. He was told at once what to do about it, and he simply followed instruction without having to bother his head about theory. If this did not do the trick, a plane would arrive 4 hours later with the team of specialists. After nationalization, we could no longer phone for help, and the few technicians who might have been able to deal with minor faults had gone. This illustrates precisely what problems the revolution faced when it embarked on the adventure of converting the colony into a fatherland. Cuba was crippled by its dependent status, and walking on its own feet had not been easy. Half of its children did not go to school in 1958, but Fidel Castro has said many times that ignorance was much broader and more serious than mere illiteracy. The big campaign of 1961 mobilized an army of young volunteers to teach all Cubans to read and write, and the results astonished the world. According to the UNESCO's Department of Education, Cuba now has the lowest percentage of illiterates and the highest percentage attending primary and secondary school in Latin America. But the inherited curse of ignorance cannot be overcome overnight or in 12 years. A lack of efficient technicians, administrative incompetence, and disorganization of production, and a bureaucratic fear of creative imagination, and decision still obstructs the development of socialism. Yet, despite the whole structure and potence forged by 4.5 centuries of oppression, Cuba is being reborn with an enthusiasm that never flags against obstacles. It matches its strength, its gaiety, its audacity. Cuba's sugar was the knife, imperialism the assassin. Is building on sugar better than building on sand? Jean Paul Sartre asked himself when he was in Cuba in 1960. On the pier in the port of Guayabal, which exports sugar in bulk, pelicans wheel over an enormous shed. Entering it, I am astonished to see a golden pyramid of sugar as hatches open to run the unsacked cargo down into the ships below. More cascades of gold, sugar newly brought from the mills, pour in through openings in the roof. It glints and sparkles in beams of sunlight. This warm mountain, too big for my eyes to take in, is worth some 4 million. Here, I think to myself, is summed up all the euphoria and drama of the record harvest of 1970, a harvest which aspired, but despite human effort, was not able to reach 10 million tons. Yet the story behind the Golden Cascade is a much longer one. I think about the Francisco Sugar Company, in which Alan Dulles was a director, where I have passed a week listening to stories of the past and seeing the birth of the future. Josefina, daughter of Carla Rodriguez, who studies in a classroom that was a barrack cell, the exact place where her father was held and tortured before he died. Antonio Bastidas, the 70-year-old black who early one morning this year sees the lever of the siren with both hands dancing in the air because the mill had overfilled its quota and yelling, "Shit, man, we've done it." And no one would take Antonio's clenched hands off the lever, while the siren, which had awakened the community, was awakening all Cuba. Stories of evictions, bribery, murder, hunger, of strange occupations, which unemployment obligatory more than 6 months of every year engenders, hunting crickets in the fields, for example. But those who died did not do so in vain. Amanicio Rodriguez, for one, riddled with bullets by strike breakers at a meeting, had angrily refused a blank check from the boss. His comrades, when they went to get his body, found he owned no underwear or socks to be buried in. Or Pedro Plaza, arrested at age 20, who guided a truck full of soldiers over mines he had himself laid and was blown up with the truck and the soldiers, and so many more in this area and all over. Here, an old sugar worker told me, the people have a great love for martyrs, but only after they're dead. Before, there's nothing but complaints. It wasn't an accident, I think to myself, that Fidel Castro recruited 3/4 of his guerrillas from among the campesinos, the sugar workers, nor that Oriente province has throughout Cuba's history been the biggest source of both sugar and rebellion. I understand the accumulated rancor that made the revolution, after the big harvest of 1961, decided to take revenge on sugar, the living memory of humiliation. Was it also Cuba's fate? Did it then become a penitence? Could it now be a lever, a catapult for economic development? When a pardonable impatience set in, the revolution destroyed many cane fields and sought to diversify agriculture overnight. It didn't fall into the traditional error of dividing the latifundios into unproductive small farms, but every socialized farm proceeded to make sudden and excessive variations in its crops. Yet there had to be large-scale imports to industrialize the country, raise agricultural production, and satisfy many consumer needs, which in receiving wealth, the revolution enormously increased. Without big sugar harvests, where would the currency for these imports come from? The development of mining, particularly nickel, requires large investments, and these are being made. Fishery production, also needing enormous investments, has risen 8 times thanks to the growth of the fleet. Ambitious plans for citrus fruit production are being implemented, but the interval of years between planting and harvesting demands patience. The revolution, after discovering that it had confused the knife with the assassin, turned sugar, which had been responsible for underdevelopment, into an instrument of development. There was no alternative but to use the fruits of monoculture independence, born of Cuba's incorporation into the world market, to break the spine of that monoculture independence. No longer was the income earned by sugar to go to consolidate the structure of submission. Imports of machinery and industrial installations have risen by 40% since 1958. The economic surplus generated by sugar has been mobilized to develop basic industries and to see that neither lands nor workers are condemned to idleness. Cuba had 5,000 tractors and 30,000 automobiles when the Bastilla dictatorship fell. Today it has 50,000 tractors, although they are sent to a large extent, although they are to a large extent wasted because of organizational deficiencies. Nothing remains of that fleet of automobiles, mainly luxury models, except a few specimens fit for scrap iron. The cement industry and electrical plants are growing with extraordinary speed. Big fertilizer factories created by the revolution have enabled Cuba to use 5 times more fertilizer than 1958. Reservoirs built all over the island today contain 73 times as much water as was available in 1958, and Cuba has made a 7-league boot advance in areas under irrigation. New highways throughout Cuba have broken what once seemed to be the eternal isolation of many regions. Holstein bulls brought in to increase the meager milk production from Cebu cattle have produced 800,000 crossbred cows by artificial insemination. Much progress, but still not enough, has been made in the mechanization of sugar cane cutting and loading, mainly using Cuban inventions. A new work system is being organized with difficulty to replace the old one, which could not survive the changes brought by the revolution. Professional macheteros, cane cutters, who are prisoners of sugar, are an extinct species. For them, too, the revolution meant freedom to choose other less grueling work, and for their children, the chance of scholarships to study in the cities. Unavoidably, the sugar workers' liberation has resulted in serious upsets in the economy. In the 1970 harvest, Cuba had to use 3 times as many workers as before. Mainly volunteers or soldiers or people from different jobs, thereby harming other rural and urban activities. The harvesting of other products, the work in the factories. Here one must bear in mind that in a socialist society, unlike in a capitalist one, workers are not motivated by fear of unemployment or by avarice. Other drives, solidarity, collective responsibility, awareness of the duties and rights that move a man beyond selfishness must be brought into play, and the conscience of a whole people is not changed in a moment. When the revolution came to power, most Cubans, according to Fidel Castro, were not even anti-imperialists. Cubans became radicalized along with their revolution as challenges and responses, blows and counterblows between Havana and Washington followed one upon the other. And as the revolution proceeded to turn its promises of social justice into solid facts, it built 170 new hospitals and as many polyclinics and made medical care free and multiplied by 3 the number of students enrolled at all levels and also made education free. More than 300,000 children and youths benefit today from scholarships, and boarding schools and kindergartens have proliferated. A large part of the population pays no rent, and no one pays for water, light, public telephones, funerals, or sporting events. Spending on social services increased 5 times in a few years, but now that everyone has education, shoes, necessities multiply geometrically, and production can only grow arithmetically. Cuba has been compelled to escalate its exports, and sugar continues to be its major resource. Many products are in short supply. In 1970, fruit and refrigerators and clothing craze, part of the daily routine, not solely due to disorganized distribution. The essential cause of scarcity is the new abundance of consumers. The country now belongs to everyone. Consumption is by all, not just a few. Thus is scarcity of an opposite kind to that in other Latin American countries. The revolution is indeed living through the hard times of transition and sacrifice. The Cubans themselves have learned that socialism is built with clenched teeth and that revolution is no evening stroll. But after all, if the future came on a platter, it would not be of this world. Revolution is forced to sleep his eyes open. In economic terms, this also costs dearly. Constantly harassed by invasion and sabotage, it does not fall because strange dictatorship. It is defended by a people in arms. The expropriators do not give up. The brigade that landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 was not only made up of former Bastille soldiers and policemen, but also the previous owners of more than 370,000 hectares of land, nearly 10,000 buildings, 70 factories, 10 sugar mills, 3 banks, 5 mines, and 12 cabarets. Guatemalan dictator Miguel Hidalgo Fuentes provided training camps for the expedition in return, as he later admitted, for U.S. promises of cash which were never paid, and an increase in the Guatemalan sugar quota in the U.S. market. In 1965, another sugar country, the Dominican Republic, was invaded. This time, according to their commander, General Bruce Palmer, by 40,000 U.S. Marines ready to stay indefinitely in this country in view of the reigning confusion. The vertical drop in sugar prices had been a factor in setting off popular indignation. People rose against the military dictatorship, and U.S. troops arrived promptly to restore order. They left 4,000 dead in battles fought by patriots, body to body, in a crowded Santo Domingo slum between the Rio Osma and the Caribbean. The Organization of American States, which has the memory of a donkey, never forgetting where it eats, blessed the invasion and supplied it with new forces. The germ of another Cuba had to be exterminated.